We find in the writings of Justin Martyr, about a century after the time of Paul, the use of the phrase form of God in the same way that Paul uses that phrase. We can see from this that the expression form of God was an established phrase with a clear and distinct meaning in this period of Greek. So the usage of form to describe essential nature, beginning with Plato, continues through the whole ancient period into the early Christian era. In other words, the expression form of God as God's essential nature was not an expression that was awkward or difficult for the ancient reader of Greek, as it is somewhat awkward or difficult in translation for the modern English reader. Let us read a passage from Justin and see how he uses the expression. Justin writes, "And neither do we honor with many sacrifices and garlands of flowers such deities as men have formed and set in shrines and called gods, since we see that they are soulless and dead and have not the form of God. They make what they call a god, which we consider not only senseless, but to be even insulting to God, who, having ineffable glory and form, thus gets his name attached to things which are corruptible and require constant service." In this passage from Justin Martyr, the form of God stands in contrast to the idols of the pagans, whose idols are soulless and dead, whereas God is living and that eternally so. He has an ineffable glory and form. He is not corruptible, does not require constant service like the images made by the pagan worshippers. In other words, Justin uses the word form of God for God's essential nature as the living God, the eternal God, the God who is not part of material substance, but exists of himself and from himself, the God who is Spirit. So then, both the use of morphe for essential nature and the use of the phrase en morphe theou for God's essential nature are established usages in ancient Greek. However, in English, the phrase form of God remains awkward because many English speakers are not used to Plato's use of morphe and its translation to English as form to describe the essential nature of something. However, the phrase form of God in English translation, or en morphe theou in the Greek, properly describes the essential nature of God. What makes God to be God? He is self-existent, living, eternal, almighty, and so forth. He is the opposite of the form of the idols, which are soulless, lifeless, dead, corruptible. So then, when we turn to the phrase in Paul's letter to the Philippians that Jesus is en morphe theou, in the form of God, the sense of the affirmation that Jesus is in essential nature God is clear in Greek and is clear in English if the reader is familiar with Plato's use of morphe and his translation into English as form. That the expression form of God refers to God's essential nature, to what makes God to be God, is confirmed by the parallel in the next verse where Jesus takes the form of a bondservant. He becomes a bondservant, that is to say, he is bound over to do the will of another, to do the bidding of another. If we take form of a bondservant to mean mere appearance of a bondservant, the passage makes no sense at all. Jesus did not merely appear to be a bondservant. He became a bondservant. He submitted himself wholly and fully to do the will of the Father, to be obedient, to humble himself, even to death, the death of a cross. And so the use of the phrase form of a bondservant in parallel to form of God confirms that the word form in English, or morphe in Greek, is being used to describe the essential nature of the bondservant, namely obedience and submission, or the essential nature of God, namely self-existence, eternality, almighty power, and so forth. Again, to read Paul's text, let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. Obviously, when Jesus took the form of a bondservant and came in the likeness of men, he really became a man. He became servant to God the Father in his human nature. And he was found in appearance as a man, and he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. The phraseology of this passage is clear that Jesus as bondservant is in essence bondservant. His essential nature as he became a man was bondservant. Otherwise, Paul could not say, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. The problem is that the choice of the word appearance in verse 8 again produces an awkwardness that need not be there in translation. The use of the English term in appearance in verse 8 leaves again the reader with a sense of appearance versus reality. It would be far better to render verse 8, and being found visibly as a man. The point of that passage is that it was inescapably the case that the one who is in the form of God took the form of a bondservant and was visibly a man. It was inescapably the truth. It was obvious he was a man. And so he did what a bondservant does. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And this is the mindset that ought to be in Christians. So then the phrase form of God in English translation, or en morphe theou in Greek, refers to the essential nature of God. Likewise, the phrase form of a bondservant refers to the essential nature of a bondservant. The form of God is his eternality, his infinity, his almighty power, and so forth. The form of a bondservant is his essential nature as one who is obedient to his Lord, who humbles himself and does what he is told to do. So then, to describe Jesus as being en morphe theou in the form of God is to describe Jesus as being in essential nature God, in essence God, to have the substance of God, to be God with no limiting qualification added to that statement. He is God in every sense that God the Father is God, other than that he is the Son of the Father. So then, let me suggest a slightly improved translation of this passage. Who, being in the essential nature of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the essential nature of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men, and being found visibly a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. The Greek phrase en morphe theou, as we have seen, means essential nature. While the translation form of God is a somewhat word-for-word rendering, it produces the problem that most English readers don't know the philosophical use of the word form as we find it in the translation of Plato's works. However, if we instead simply represent the meaning of the Greek phrase en morphe theou in English in a clear and distinct way, my suggestion is to use the phrase in the essential nature of God, then the English reader grasps the meaning right away. This one who is being in essential nature God, while being in essential nature God, made himself of no reputation by taking the essential nature of a bondservant and coming in human likeness. Likewise, in verse 8, the expression as in appearance a man leaves one with the suggestion that he's only appearing to be a man. It would be better to render this phrase, and being found visibly a man. The point of the Greek text is that in the incarnation, God the Son is now visibly to himself, visibly to anyone else, a man. One who is under the authority of God, one who is bound to do the will of God, one who is in essential nature bondservant. So then we can conclude that the Apostle Paul understood that Jesus was in fact true God, in essential nature God, God in every sense of the word God, as a Jew would use the word God to describe Yahweh. In other words, the idea of Jesus as true God, God from God, light from light, very God from very God, while expressed distinctively in that way in the Nicene Creed, is an idea already clearly present in the Apostle Paul. Paul understands Jesus to be the Son of God, and he understands Jesus to be in essential nature God. He is therefore God from God, light from light, very God from very God. The notion that the deity of Jesus is an idea that slowly develops over time and does not come to clear expression unto the time of the great Christological controversies culminating in the Nicene Creed is simply wrong. The idea that Jesus is true and real God, in essential nature God, and morphe theou in the Greek, is here in the Apostle Paul in the middle of the 1st century.